Good afternoon. This is David Unsworth, host of the PanAm Post English podcast. In just under 6 months, Mexico will be holding its 2018 election on July 1st. At stake is the Mexican presidency, as well as elections for all 500 members of the lower house of Congress and all 128 Senate seats. Current President Enrique Peña Nieto isn't eligible to run due to term limits. Currently leading in the polls is Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador of the left-wing Morena party. He was narrowly defeated in the 2006 election and also finished a strong second in 2012. Will AMLO, as he's often called, win the election? Can one of the other leading candidates pull off an upset? What is to be expected from his presidency? And are investors right to be spooked right now? So, Lopez Obrador is a longtime political figure. He's best known for heading up the capital region of Mexico City from 2000 to 2005. He's the oldest candidate in the field, or the oldest leading candidate in the field. He's been around for a long time. He ran for president in 2006 in a very tightly contested election, the closest election in modern Mexican history. He lost by less than 250,000 votes. It was about 16 million to 15 million and change to Felipe Calderón of the right-wing PAN party, the Partido de Acción Nacional, or the Party of National Action. And then in 2012, he placed a close second. He lost by about 6 points to current President Enrique Peña Nieto. Lopez Obrador is from Tabasco State in southeastern Mexico. It's a state that kind of straddles before you get to the Yucatan Peninsula, it straddles the Guatemalan border and the Caribbean coast. And recently a lot of headlines have been appearing, we wrote about this in the PanAm Post today actually, that investors are spooked by a potential Lopez Obrador presidency, that he's something of a threat to the global economic order. Americans aren't following the Mexican presidential election much. I mean, I think, unfortunately, I think Americans in general don't pay a whole lot of attention to politics in South and Central America and the Caribbean. Perhaps we pay more attention to something like Cuba because it's so close to our shores. We pay attention to what's going on in Venezuela because it's such a disaster. But, I think sadly we don't focus enough on what's going on in terms of politics with our southern neighbors. But Lopez Obrador, he clearly would not be my first candidate, but I don't think he's necessarily the far-left boogeyman he's been made out to be by the press. Just doing a little research into him here, I was rather surprised. He might end up being something like a situation what you had in Peru, where the first kind of center-left candidate was elected in a long time, this guy named Ollanta Humala. This was I believe it would have been the 2011 Peruvian presidential election, and investors were very concerned. Humala ended up charting a pretty centrist course, though, and his management of the Peruvian economy was actually largely applauded. Lopez Obrador headed up the largest city in, the largest city in North America, Mexico City, and he did some pretty interesting things. The first thing that comes to mind is he hired former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani to put together his crime policy. Giuliani was famous for this kind of zero-tolerance policy based on something called the broken windows theory, which says that if you let smaller crimes proliferate, they will eventually encourage bigger crimes. So if you let vandalism slide, graffiti, broken windows, public urination, public intoxication or marijuana consumption and so forth, Giuliani really cracked down on these things, and although I don't agree with everything that Giuliani did there, I don't know how much I agree with the broken windows theory, it did lead to a reduction in crime in New York City, and that trend has generally continued. New York City went from being one of the highest crime cities in the 80s to being one of the safest cities in America. Lopez Obrador also partnered with the richest man in Mexico, telecommunications mogul Carlos Slim, to develop downtown Mexico City, and he gave considerable tax incentives and zoning concessions to big construction companies. There was a construction boom that took place under Lopez Obrador. So not exactly, at least if we can extrapolate what he would do in the future based on his tenure heading up Mexico City, it wasn't exactly some Bolshevist plot to undermine and undercut the business class. I'm looking here at some of his economic proposals from his most recent presidential campaign. Job creation. He is trying to grow the economy. He at that point he was aiming to grow the economy 6% annually, generate 1.2 million new jobs a year. Austerity, that's something that I really like. He pledged to reduce salaries of government officials and eliminate unnecessary posts, claimed that he'd be able to save around $30 billion US per year. Progressive fiscal reforms, which is, a graduated income tax, basically. It's saying it's the opposite of a flat tax, where, with a flat tax, say of 20%, it doesn't matter if you make $1,000 or $100 million, you pay 20% of that. Obviously, most countries do have graduated income taxes. Reasonable enough. He pledged no new taxes, and he also pledged to usher in a new era of competition and monopolies. So, well, I am concerned about some things that he'd like to do. Perhaps Lopez Obrador would really not be the disaster for the business community that he might be made out to be. He's leading right now in the polls by not an insurmountable margin, but let's say a comfortable margin. A recent poll in December of 17 put him at around 31 to 32%. It put the candidate of PAN at 23% and the candidate of the PRI at around 15%. There are a couple other candidates. There's actually the former First Lady of Mexico has thrown her hat into the ring. I don't think, though, at this point that any other candidate really has a shot at winning. There's an independent candidate named Jaime Rodriguez Calderon, and another independent candidate, the former First Lady Margarita Zavala. But they don't seem to have legs at this point. Speaking of the PRI is historically the most powerful party in Mexico. They actually held the record, I believe, in Latin America for greatest period of political continuity. They ruled the country from 1929 to 2000. And they're still the dominant, they're still the largest party by membership in Mexico. They're the dominant player in the Mexican Congress. They've got 206 of 500 seats in the lower house of Congress. They've got 56 of 128 Senate seats, and nearly half of Mexico's governorships. They have 15 out of 32. Their candidate, I should actually say these are all presumptive candidates because they're not official, but it's as good as official from what I understand. The PRI candidate is named Jose Antonio Meade. He comes from a prominent family of predominantly Irish and Lebanese descent, and he has served in a plethora of cabinet posts. He's been everything from Secretary of Energy to Secretary of Finance to Secretary of Foreign Affairs. He's also served in some diplomatic postings. controversy with regard to Meade at this point is that he's been allegedly handpicked as the candidate by Enrique Peña Nieto. A common criticism of Latin American political parties at this point is their primary nomination process. It's still relatively uncommon to have the type of primary campaigns that you see in the U.S., for example, where they're conducted over a period of months and they go state by state. In some states, any registered voter can vote in any party's primary, and other states have closed primaries where only members of the Republican or Democratic Party can vote in those primaries. But Meade appears to have lost some popularity from that. I think, probably what we'll see over the coming decades is more and more Latin American political parties will trend towards the American system, where it really is put to the people, and they are the ones who get to elect, primary nominees, who then head to a general election. So the PRI is kind of the centrist party in Mexico. Some might say center-left, but at this point he is lagging kind of a distant third, and it would be reasonable enough to assume that if someone is going to overtake him, it's probably not going to be Jose Antonio Meade, much more likely a Ricardo Anaya Cortez, and we could envision a scenario where voters who were considering voting for the PRI are saying, well, I don't want AMLO to win, so I'm actually going to throw my support for Ricardo Anaya Cortez because he has a greater chance of winning. Cortez is the youngest candidate in the field. He's just 38. And the PAN, the Partido de Acción Nacional, most recently had the presidency under Vicente Fox. Ricardo Anaya is an attorney. He's got a law degree as well as a PhD in political science, and he is from Central Querétaro state, which is located just outside of Mexico City, a small state. He's best known for serving in the Chamber of Deputies, or the lower house of Mexico's Congress, what we in the United States call the U.S. House of Representatives. And he served as president of that body from 2013 to 2014. Most recently, he was head of the PAN party, a position he won overwhelmingly with 80% of the vote. He's, perhaps not surprisingly, actually, the right-wing party, the PAN, and people like Vicente Fox have been very outspoken in their criticism of Trump and some of Trump's more outlandish rhetoric. Ricardo Anaya, for example, gave a lecture in D.C., I believe it was at George Washington, recently, in which he took Trump to task, in which he very heavily criticized the idea of building this wall. So, as we wrap it up here, just looking forward, looking towards the horizon here, the most important issue, at least from a global, commercial, economic, and trade standpoint, that one of these three candidates is going to have to face is the renegotiation of NAFTA. Now, as a libertarian, I've spoken about this issue rather frequently. I hope they'll just leave NAFTA alone. I think NAFTA has been great for Canada, great for the United States, and great for Mexico. I think Donald Trump claims that it's unfair to the United States. I don't really see that. I think that opening up Mexico to investment, opening it up to manufacturing and factories is exactly what Mexico needs. They need those jobs. And if something is going to be done more competitively in Mexico than in the United States, well, let's do it in Mexico, by all means. You can't keep a non-productive industry, or an industry that's losing money in the United States, if you can do it more efficiently at a lower cost in Mexico. So, of course, there's going to be some debate about workers' rights and environmental protections in Mexico. Obviously, that's what the American left typically bases their criticism of free trade agreements on. They want to make sure that workers who are getting these jobs overseas are being paid enough, that appropriate environmental safeguards are in place, and so forth. But this is something we'll keep an eye on here at the PanAm Post. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of recent polling here. I just saw one last month. But we'll pay more and more attention to this as time goes on. And hopefully, whoever wins, we can salvage the best parts of NAFTA, and hopefully not destroy it, not cut off our noses to spite our faces, so to speak. This has been David Unsworth, host of the PanAm Post English podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And of course, a happy new year, a happy 2018.